So we have both Bob and Barbara coming to the table, and we'd be really happy to entertain some questions. There was an interesting point that Barbara just made about the 50-year anniversary of the National Historic Preservation Act in the United States coming up in 2016. 2016 is also the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service founding in 1916. So we have a little conjunction there that maybe should get some energy behind it. Do we have any questions or comments? You don't get out for lunch yet, so we can certainly move these down the aisles.
Hi, Jessica Brown from Massachusetts, and a question for Barbara. Very interesting to see the sort of parallels on the cultural side of the equation. I come from the nature conservation side of things, and we have long realized and are waking up to the importance of landscape scale conservation. But to hear your parallel on the cultural side was very important for me. One of my questions relates to, it seems like you are arguing the designation as a national monument will protect these places, and yet you also showed us an example where 80% of the area is under exploration for oil and gas and carbon dioxide. So it seems like designation is obviously not enough. Management is part of the question, and I'm wondering, are there governance options apart from just BLM being in charge, but rather collaborative management relationships that are emerging or that are possible?
Here you go, Bob. Here's the answer question I know you want to ask. There are some who think that the BLM monument should transfer to the Park Service and be managed that way. And in fact, when Grand Staircase was made a monument, I remember John Cook, who was the regional director for the Park Service in Denver, was beside himself that the management did not transfer. He couldn't believe it, couldn't understand, because in the past exactly that had happened, and it still happens sometimes. You can see national forest units that become monuments are then transferred to the Park Service. I know MPCA would be fond of that idea if that's the National Parks Conservation Association would be transferred. But I asked Bruce Babbitt actually that question once when he made these BLM monuments and created the National Landscape Conservation System when he was Secretary of the Interior, what he had in mind, what was he trying to achieve with that? And he said, well, I wanted to make the folks at BLM feel better about their jobs, which I thought was an interesting question, an interesting answer. But I don't know that he knew what he was doing when he got it started. But since then, we have the Secretary order that's basically requiring greater protection. The National Landscape Conservation System, which was Babbitt's idea, has now been codified into law. So I think as a different kind of protection and engaging another agency, that there's still many people there that think they're just in the oil and gas grazing business, to think of themselves also as conservationists and preservationists could be a good thing. And even though it's only just a little over 10 years old, so it's still evolving as a system, I kind of like to keep it where it is and see if we can't get more funding for BLM and do more to push this idea of conservation into that agency. Maybe not to be the same as the Park Service, but better than they've been in the past.
I have two comments or questions.
George
to
again.
The presenters. George Abung is my name. Now, the first is on the issue of mining. Currently, in the continent of Africa, we are having a major problem, and this is related to the issue of sustainability and world heritage, within and outside. And some of the countries in Africa, and Africa, of course, now is probably the last frontier of economic kind of scramble because of the resources that are just emerging from everywhere. So every power wants to go there. And people are seeing, people who are living by the World Heritage Sites are questioning, why do we have these natural places when we cannot extract these resources? And of course the governments are the proponents of this because they are seeing resources in these places. And maybe IUCN and ICOMOS can comment on this. But it's a major, major problem. And it has gone into this question of conservation versus development. Now, I would like to get your comment on this. I know that, and I like very much that you are presenting sites that are not in the World Heritage, but by looking at them, I think some of these sites should actually be in the World Heritage. Now, how do you balance this issue of conserving as well as extracting resources within these World Heritage places, knowing that according to an agreement by the mining organization, International Mining Organization, that World Heritage sites should be no-go zone areas for miners. But now we have this problem coming up, and I can see it's also here. Now, on the other hand, is the question of continuity and change. Mm-hmm. And you have given us some very interesting examples now, which you have created, and I like it very much. You gave the example of the irrigation in that part by the military place, the changes within the park, the growing of new trees in parks and all that, which I believe if it was a natural site, IUCN would say no, that is introduced plant, so it doesn't belong. But how do you measure change and continuity? What is the degree? Is there a solution, or do you just decide that this looks beautiful and it looks balanced? And how do you help managers of these places to balance and to understand that this is how far they can go without destroying the authenticity and integrity of the place?
Thank you. Well, why don't you go first?
No, go ahead.
Okay. The mining problem is difficult in this country, and Teresa, who's is one of many Southwest tribes that hold Mount Taylor sacred. Mount Taylor is threatened by a uranium mine. And in this country, we have a law that was passed in 1872 that is still on the books that gives hard rock mine the highest priority of land use. So the federal government can try to stipulate it or they can try to manage it, but they cannot deny a permit for a hard rock mine. So if uranium mining is successful at Mount Taylor, eventually there will be no Mount Taylor. It will, the deposit will be removed, the mountain will subside, it will be gone, and this will be tragedy and Teresa will, I'm sure, tell you that from her very personal relationship to it later on. Oil and gas, coal do not have that same priority in the United States. So a federal agency can deny a permit for an oil and gas development. So even though the land is leased, and leases are forever, which is something we need to deal with here, the leases at Canyon the Ancients go back to the 50s, before it was a monument, before there was the FLPMA law, which creates a cultural resource protection as part of BLM's mission. So either the federal government could buy out the lease, but even without that, they can deny a permit. And I showed you some slides of a place called Mockingbird Mesa there, where there's a potential for a large oil and gas development that will be right on top of those sites. And the BLM could deny that permit, and may, quite frankly, depending on how that development goes forward. So our laws do not give us, they're not strong enough to give us the protections we need for these places. But my hope is that BLM could do it, and in my view, there should be no mining in Canyon the Ancients. But there are other places where, if we had the data, we could direct the activity away from the resources, and actually, as opposed to, as I said, right on top of the resources, because they're making plans without the data on bad science.
To the issue of those decision-making process with regard to continuity and change, we ground everything in our decisions based on a clear understanding of the importance of the place and the character of the place. Through our research, through our documentation, we are teasing out, to the extent that we can, what are the physical aspects of that landscape that are critical to an understanding. In the parks, we have these places because they tell the story of our history. So we filter it through that story. How can we tell that story? How can we make a transformative experience to a visitor coming to a place to learn? And so when we're evaluating changes, it's passed through that filter of what do we know historically existed? What's the story we're trying to tell? And importantly, what are the factors we're dealing with today that are going to allow us to have a sustainable solution? So we have to adapt and adjust to those issues, and it becomes more subjective. It's much easier. I don't want to say anything's easy, but it's easier to replicate historic conditions. This is the way it was in 1878. This is what we should do now. That's always our first filter, but more often than not, as we're moving forward in the field. Not for every feature, and certainly at the broad scale, we have to look at adaptive management that still achieves the goals. It puts us in a more subjective place. There's lots of debate over what's appropriate, what's compatible, but it's where we're at, and it's where we have to be when we're dealing with things like diseases and death and sustainability and water use in the West. We have no choice if we want to be at the table as part of the problem-solving team. We cannot take a certain one-option position. We won't be at the table any longer. So how do we advocate for what is really important and balance the real issues of our full resource management picture with trying to achieve our preservation goals? It makes it a more complicated, I think much more interesting conversation, but it also opens it up to all kinds of opinion about what is right or what is best. And we do it as a team and hope someone will come back and revisit it, probably in the next 10 years. But we're sitting down and we at least document a process for making the decision. And if we decide to make a change, it's clear why and what we're losing, but also what we're achieving.
We have another question. I just wanted to make a comment on a couple of underlying themes here. One is that what we're seeing in the West and the large lands is basically a conflict of values, and that the resources in these large landscapes have not been well inventoried and well studied, and in particular the kind of archaeology that we traditionally practice, which is the flag, avoid, identify something you can see easily on a quick time frame, low budget project, and then avoid that, but right next to it or very close to it there are other resources. So I think what we're seeing here is this consideration now, which I find very fascinating. 21st century is about multiple values coming to the table in multiple voices. And then the second point to Bob's considerations, that historic significance is what leads the story. And you said story, and just to pop it back up to World Heritage, it would be the statement of outstanding universal value being the lead story, and the criteria under which the site was nominated being the lead story, and then judging the character that embodies those qualities. So across sites of local, regional, national, and international importance, the same kind of lenses can be used.
It was, thank you for both the papers. It was very interesting because there were two sides of the same coin. And I think the first paper showed what can be done, but even that with a lot of, I have a lot of questions about it, because it doesn't mean it's hunky-dory at all, because there is gaps in the overall, which is the paradigm that's there, and that needs to be done. Some work has to be done on that, and you and I can't do it. It has to be higher, because it's something, that certainly, now later on you said something about knowledge, that you did have a knowledge base, which I didn't sort of see before, because you just said how you did it. But the second paper, I think that is very interesting. It brings in all the contentious issues that can be implied even in the first one, So that's what I think in this, this is a responsible area of work and activity, because it is everyone's resources. So nothing there can be nothing implicit. It all has to be explicit. And I think unless we work on that level, whether it is the universities that are to do, and also this whole question that's coming up is, yours was a more, what is called architectural approach, planning approach. Now, are we recognizing the conservator as a separate professional in his or her own right, as a 21st century professional, 20th and 21st century professional. And then I would like to go back to the how to handle these issues of that Bureau of Land Management. Or, for me, this is very common. I have a lot of experience in this, you know, but the fact is that they're all legally there. And they've also been empowered by legally to do what they are doing. Now, how do you change that? You know, so it's all right to say you are allowed to look at some buildings, explore and do one or small things, but that's a compromise. Now, how does one increase the protection? You know, that is what I am concerned. With this multiplicity of stakeholders in the same place, are there any ways that you have in National Park Service worked out ways of doing that?
Well, I am not with the National Park Service. I'm sometimes their worst nightmare, but I'm also sometimes their very best friend. But I do work for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and we are the national advocate for the protection of historic and cultural places. And honestly, my line about Jamestown was because up until 2004, we really weren't very engaged with being an advocate for saving cultural resources and archaeological resources. And when we started doing that, I had some donors tell me this was mission, drift.
I know.
And we shouldn't be doing it. And yet, if we stop doing it, I think there's not a lot of voices that will take our place. So I feel like it's important work for us to do. And we're trying to get more of our own donors to feel that way as well. What I think I'm going to talk personally, because this has been something I've been personally doing for the last 28 years I've been at the National Trust. I feel like many of these land managers, I'm not fighting them so much anymore about the need to do it. Now it's how to do it. And as I said, some of that is about money. I met with the BLM director 2 weeks ago in Washington, and I said we need these large surveys earlier, not these skinny little project-driven 106 surveys. He said, you're telling me everything the BLM archaeologists have been telling me for years, but how do we fund it? 7 cents an acre. So, but we're trying to figure out ways that maybe through other pots of money that they have, they're really good at borrowing from our cultural pot and putting it into something else. We're thinking about borrowing it back from some of the energy money that they have. And then the other thing, in all honesty, is talking to the energy companies, this doesn't work for them either. And so we might be able to work with them to create maybe an additional fee they would add to the permit to create a fund that could be used for doing some of this survey work way up front, because it would save them time at the end as they were trying to plan their projects with data as opposed to what they have now, which is they're often having to shift project designs because they're running into these archaeological sites.
Negotiation is not enough, because whatever good happens, it has to happen perpetually.
Yeah.
And you need a law.
We do.
Yeah.
And we're having this election in a few weeks, which is it's going to have a huge effect on our ability to
and that means very high level. Like, it's a law. Nothing else.
Bob, do you have any comments on that?
No.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much. Just responding this conversation. Yes. The actual cultural landscapes, it's a very soft, sweet approach to this one. It has very strong potential in it. However, that is we're facing the problem between it's in a legal protection, sometimes beyond that. How can we find the way to approach to that things? Because if it's a strong control, could be national park. Its boundaries, we have to think about it. But it's in the potential of the cultural landscape, it's different. That is, I'm thinking, it's more like approach, or what can we do? Yes. Law cannot solve the problem. As long as if going deeper in the law, I think it's in a way we cannot go beyond that. I'm feeling it. I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt it.
Good comment, thank you.
Thank you both. That was really good, and I think I agree with the two sides of the coin. It's really good to look at the scale here. We had several conversations this morning about the nature and culture, and I think in both cases, I'm just wondering how that's working, and, is that another arena for sort of more dialogue and discussion?
That's another area for more dialogue and discussion, I think. We've been trying, the environmental community in this country is large, it's mighty, it's well-funded. Many organizations with, National Trust is about on a really good day, maybe about 50,000 members. And, if you combine the memberships of the Nature Conservancy and the Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club and, the Environmental Defense Fund, it overwhelms us. And so if those folks won't embrace that these landscapes, the speaker this morning has said the world is a cultural landscape. I'm with you 100%. But that is not always the case. And I have found that some of these environmental groups are comfortable with the native use, but as soon as Lewis and Clark came along, we're done with you. So we're struggling right now with the Wilderness Act. And I think, Ethan Carr, you're the one who first kind of turned me on to the reaction to what happened there, even within national parks when that was passed. And the Wilderness Act suggests this untrammeled by man thing, that somewhere out there, these landscapes that man has never been on or never, I don't know where they are, but somewhere they are, and they're designated wilderness areas. And so we're fighting a group called Wilderness Watch, who is now winning and getting judgments that are about removing these cabins in wilderness areas. We're going to have a really lively discussion about that in Spokane at our upcoming conference. So we need those folks to see that these landscapes are natural and cultural, that there is not nature over here and cultural over there. Whether it's a continuum or however we do it, if we don't bring these pieces together, we're fighting our own, let alone some of the other forces at work to damage both these landscapes.
And I'll just build off of that. Within our own organization, certainly the last 20 years, we have a lot of passion in the National Park Service and a lot of vision for how to move things forward, and we have a natural resource focus and a cultural. And I think the wonderful trend that's happened is the problem solving and decision making, especially when you're looking at stewardship and your vision for the future, has been collaborative, where you're looking to try to solve a problem by bringing the natural resource specialists in, by bringing the facility specialists in. The larger you can make the group, the more complicated the conversation is. But it has led to success, because at the end of that painful process, and it can be very painful, you have hopefully a common vision, and there's an understanding for the decisions that are being made. So it's not something that's being handed to somebody else to manage or implement. They're part of the process, they understand it, and they've helped shape it. So that natural cultural, I've seen there's a much bigger umbrella. We're more comfortable sitting down and problem solving and talking and learning from each other as far as what are your issues. Because a lot of times we're not aware of the specifics of the natural resource specialists and their goals and what they're trying to manage, and we need to be.
So let me just touch on a few of the points that were raised, because I think we need to bring these forward in our discussions. Maybe a highlight is multiple forces and voices and the stakeholders at the table, and a number of those stakeholder groups are not in this room. So one of the things we're going to be doing with trying to put forward some sort of statement, declaration, way forward is speaking to people who aren't here, as well as speaking to each other about what our aspirations are. That group problem-solving process that creates a shared vision, as Bob has said, is complicated, and it can reach a good conclusion, but on the other side, when I talk about historic urban landscapes tomorrow, one of the factors is the mobility of populations and the mobility globally, and how our reliance in the 20th century and our focus on local communities and their voices is being modified by the fact that our communities are in flux globally. So there's a challenge there when you build consensus and then the players change and the stakeholders shift. How well does that consensus hold? The issue of increasing protection and the question of how, I think all of us need to think about and see in these coming presentations how those ideas unfold, because the how is sort of at the nuts and bolts. Coalition of Nature and Culture it's interesting because we are, my husband and I, Jim Donovan, are both landscape architects, and we've always supported the Nature Conservancy and the National Trust and the Sierra Club, and sort of like rainbow worlds, mostly green on our side, not human health and welfare, but the environment and land and people. And there's been a shift in the past 25 years, I'd say, in kind of what those organizations are doing in looking at their literature, that they talk about local initiatives, they talk about working with communities, they talk about visioning plans and those kinds of ideas in the same way that Bob Page talked about our practice shifting when we were fighting the architects and the conservators for standing, right? Bob and I were there. In the early 1980s, I would have pushed your timeline back a few decades, Bob. What we're saying is that in those early days when we were fighting for standing to say landscape is important, it has value as a cultural resource, we were trying to define it quite purely and saying, okay, we can take these historic documents and we can take these landscapes back to what they were historically. But the construct now is, okay, so let's all sit down together and talk about what's appropriate. How do we manage change? Are we going to, what's retained of the character, which Bob didn't really talk about? Because there are many of these places that we will go to and we will have historic documentation, but many aspects of the character will not remain intact. So the issue of what remains is what faces our generation and how we manage what remains, whether we decide to reinterpret or reinstate, reconstruct in some way, which we actually do not foster in the United States in our guidelines. We say you can reconstruct, but it's not really favored. What you should do is manage what you inherit. So the responsibilities of our generation toward the future are to understand what we have, what we inherit, and then how we move that forward. So Bob and Barbara, thanks very much.